Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse on your favorite streaming platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, X, Threads, and Facebook at Red Treehouse Pod. And now you can find the Red Treehouse on Patreon. Join the Red Treehouse community for as little as $3 per month and receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. As always, if you have a scary story or topic you'd like me to feature on an upcoming episode, email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. Important note: sources for this episode can be found in the show notes. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. In this episode of The Red Treehouse, we're going to explore a terrific horror fiction story, A Therapy Session, written by C.A. Serna. So sit back, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I read A Therapy Session. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. A Therapy Session, Part 2. Richie took out his flask and tipped his head back to get whatever drops were left. When he finished, he tossed it across the room and watched it skid toward the dining room. The metal scraping the wooden floor broke the silence of the two grown men sitting in a room telling ghost stories. One of them was holding a gun. The other was trying to piece everything together. His brain processing like a computer in the 60s, trying to land a man on the moon. "Richie," Miller began, "are you telling me that your house is haunted by a demon that was summoned by satanic farmers because their crops and homes were destroyed by a swarm of grasshoppers?" Richie busted into a boisterous laugh. It echoed so loud it gave Dr. Miller a good scare. Eventually, the laughter died to a chuckle as he spoke. "I'm sorry. It's just when you hear someone else say it out loud, your brain recognizes the insanity of it all. And maybe it is crazy. Maybe I'm a loon." His eyes shifted toward the doctor, staring with the seriousness of an executioner. "But this isn't a prank, Doc. This is my life." "Then help me understand, Richie." The patient's face twisted. "You still don't believe me. I can see it in your eyes, Doc. You still don't get it, do you?" "I just don't know what to believe at the moment. I'm not going to lie, Richie. Everything you've told me has been very hard to believe. Look, I understand, I really do. I told you you wouldn't believe me. And I hate to tell you this, Doc, but I haven't told you a single lie." "Come on, Richie," Dr. Miller interjected. "You don't really expect me to believe you, right? I'm a therapist, not a ghost hunter. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can." The hand holding the revolver rose again. "It ain't over yet, Doc. I'm not done talking." Miller had forgotten who was in charge of this therapy session. He forced the fear down his throat and said, "Okay, then I'm not done listening." With a slight smile, Richie lowered the gun and sat back into his recliner to continue his session. When my wife Marissa and I started looking for a house, this place was a godsend. It was everything we were looking for. A beautifully built home, a gorgeous backyard for my daughter Ellie to play around in, and extra rooms in case there were any more Hansons on the way. It seemed perfect. A family. Where are they then? The house looked great, but the second we stepped in, I felt something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something didn't want us here. The more I walked around in here, the heavier it felt. But there was a problem. Marissa and Ellie immediately fell in love with the place, so I just sucked it up, thinking maybe it was pre-house jitters, if that's even a real thing. I shrugged it off, and we made an offer. And a month later, we moved in. Things were going great until one night, I woke up to some awful noise coming from downstairs in the kitchen. It sounded rugged, like a blender trying to turn rocks into powder. I turned to see if Marissa was awake too, but she was gone. That's when I started to get nervous. Marissa used to sleepwalk when she was a kid, but as an adult, she only sleepwalked when she was really nervous about something. Naturally, I got out of bed and headed for the kitchen to check on my wife and to see what was going on. Stepping into the kitchen, I saw Marissa carving something into the wall using the biggest knife we had. I gently tried to grab the knife, but her grip was tight. That's when I noticed the blood on her hands. She was holding the knife so tight that the handle was digging into her skin. I tried to grab it again, but the second I reached for the knife, she turned toward me, repeatedly stabbing my left shoulder. I screamed so loud in pain that Marissa jolted awake, still stabbing me. I watched her eyes turn from confused to horrified as she realized what was happening. It all just happened so fast. I remember grabbing clean dish rags from the drawer to put on the wound, waking Ellie up, and rushing to the emergency room. Luckily, it wasn't anything major. By the time we got to the ER, the bleeding had already stopped. They cleaned up the wound, gave me some stitches and some pain meds, and sent us back home before the sun was up. Marissa got Ellie in bed again before she joined me downstairs in the living room. I was trying to calm my nerves with a stiff glass of bourbon. When Marissa came down, she sat next to me, and I asked, "Marissa, what the fuck?" "I don't know," she said. "I was just falling asleep, and all of a sudden there I was, stabbing my husband." "What were you dreaming about? Were you dreaming about stabbing me?" "I don't think so. It was weird. I saw myself walking down the stairs, pulling out the knife, and carving the wall, but I wasn't in control. I was just a puppet, watching the strings control me. I just didn't know who was holding them." Then she snatched my bourbon and finished it. The conversation ended there. We eventually found ourselves back in bed for a few hours. I called in sick the next day, hoping to get some more sleep. While I slept, Marissa took Ellie out for the day. She didn't want Ellie to go into the kitchen, for obvious reasons, so that meant it was my job to clean up her mess. That was the first time I got a real good look at it, and I'm not gonna lie, it freaked me out. I can't even begin to describe what it felt like, seeing that ominous symbol on my wall. I eventually found out it was the symbol of the Diaboli Locustarum. "The cult farmers that were burned alive?" Dr. Miller asked, interrupting his patient. How is that even possible, Richie? There has to be some logical explanation. Logical, huh? Wait here just a moment. Richie got up from the chair, ran into the kitchen, and came back with a massive leather-bound book that looked as old as Nebraska itself. He cracked the book open to a dog-eared page and said, "Read this. The Diaboli Locustarum and the Demon of Nebraska. Not much is known about the Demon of Nebraska, which was supposedly conjured by the Diaboli Locustarum. This symbol not only represented their religious faction, but was believed to be a calling card for their demon. It was written that the Locustarum marked every home with this symbol, so the demon would know which houses to attack. A few of the victims left behind diaries full of these symbols and describing them before their ghastly demise. The symbol made the doctor uneasy. It had power, ungodly power. The energy it emitted felt like radiation. The longer he stared, the sicker he felt. The wicked illustration started to bring back a familiar feeling, a bad one. The doctor turned his gaze away and asked Richie to close the book. Standing up, he felt lightheaded. The room began to spin. His vision distorted, and he wasn't sure where he was anymore. At that moment, the air became so heavy. A grim aura filled Clyde's lungs like black smoke. With every breath he took, he felt his airways tighten until he started choking, which forced him to his hands and knees, like a man begging for God to hear his prayers. Panic raged through his bloodstream. It was here. The bad feeling had returned. Everything froze. The room went quiet. There was a whisper. "Come home, Clyde. Come home." "Doc, you all right?" Miller nodded. Moving from the floor, he sat back onto the ottoman and said, forgetting his manners, "What the fuck just happened?" "That's exactly what I said when I first looked at it. Doc, this book is from 1934, and it has the same fucking symbol that Marissa made on our wall. Don't tell me there's a logical explanation for that. Unless you got a logical explanation why this symbol made you fall to your knees." Dr. Miller didn't have a response. He didn't have an explanation. There wasn't one. His sudden reunion with the bad feeling made Richie's story more believable. Richie took the doctor's silence as his answer, and he continued. "A couple weeks ago, Marissa and I were sleeping when suddenly I woke up to Ellie screaming bloody murder. I didn't hesitate. I jumped right out of bed and rushed to her room. Her door was closed, which wasn't how we left it. I tried twisting the handle, but it was locked. I didn't think. I just reacted and started breaking down the door. I was yelling out her name, hoping to get her to answer me, but it wasn't working. That's when Marissa caught up to me. 'What's happening?' she hollered, angry and afraid. Marissa tried to pull me away from the door, but it didn't matter. I had finally broken in. I barged through that door and looked right at Ellie, and I couldn't believe it. There she was, her little 7-year-old body, bundled with her favorite blanket. Her face was lit by the moonlight. She looked so peaceful. I can still picture her laying there in her Hello Kitty pajamas, Teddy wrapped up in her arms. As I looked at her, I thought, she couldn't be sleeping. With all the noises I made while busting the door down, how could she have been asleep? The dreadful thought of my child being dead drove me to start shaking her awake, maybe a little too aggressively. Marissa begged me to quit, but I couldn't hear her. I couldn't hear anything at this point. The adrenaline was the loudest thing in my head. She had to tackle me to stop, and that's when I snapped out of it. It was unbelievable. All of a sudden, it was just quiet. That's when Ellie's little head popped up from the bed. I saw her blue eyes peep open with confusion and sleepiness. Marissa and I got up off the floor. She told me to leave the room and that she was going to get Ellie back to sleep. I returned to our bedroom, ashamed and embarrassed. It didn't take long for Marissa to return, but she was pissed. As soon as she got into bed, she asked me with a very sharp tone, "What the hell was that?" "What are you talking about? You didn't hear her screaming. Then we just find her asleep like nothing happened." "Rich, you were the only one screaming," my wife said with conviction. "You know that moment when you truly believe in something? Something that you'd fight tooth and nail for, maybe even die for, only to find out that it wasn't true. It's never been true, and you're left feeling like the craziest person in the world?" That's what it felt like when she responded. I asked my wife, "You really didn't hear her scream?" She argued back, "No, I'm going back to sleep. We can talk about this in the morning." But I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Ellie's haunting screams echoing in my ears, replaying over and over. I didn't sleep that night until I got out of bed and lay outside Ellie's room, like a damn dog. I had to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, but that bad dream would soon turn into a living nightmare. All of us started hearing voices through the walls. Our furniture would levitate, then fly across the room for no reason. And, I kid you not, one afternoon a sea of birds started dive-bombing into the backyard. I was mowing the yard when the sun just disappeared, turning the sky completely black. I looked up, expecting to see a thunderstorm about to roll in. I would have never guessed that I would look up and see 100 birds falling from the sky. Each of them, bills pointed down, crashing into my yard. They flew down with such force, I heard each bird's body crack the second they hit the ground. I had to pick them up before Marissa and Ellie got home. I tried my hardest to shield Ellie from the nightmares this house was creating. But when our cat, Mr. Jingles, died, it was the beginning of the end. One morning, we noticed Mr. Jingles hadn't eaten his breakfast yet, which was odd for a fat cat like him. In the afternoon, Ellie wanted to search for him in the backyard. I didn't think about it and just told her to be careful. Next thing I knew, I heard Ellie shriek. And you know what was really fucked up about that? It was the same exact scream I heard the night I broke down her door. I bolted to the backyard and found her standing on our concrete patio, tears streaming down her face. In front of her lay a body of flesh, drowning in a pool of its own blood. It was our cat, or what remained of him. Mr. Jingle's orange fur was replaced with candy apple red flesh that glossed in the morning sun. He had been completely skinned. His legs and tail were gone too. It looked like something pulled them right off his body. His tail was tied around his neck. We never found the legs. That was it. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Ellie stopped eating. All she did was sleep. The house wasn't filled with her laughter anymore, and she never ran around the yard again. She was gone. Our daughter was gone. Marissa and I knew we had to get Ellie and ourselves out of this house. So while we started to look for a temporary place to stay, Marissa suggested that Ellie should begin therapy. Dr. Miller's ears immediately tuned in, and asked without a second thought, "Is that why you called me?" "Yes. Well, let me explain. When we started looking up therapists for Ellie, we found your website and thought you were perfect. That's how I knew who you were, that you did house visits. I wrote your number on a notepad and placed it near the phone. I guess I didn't know who else to call when," Richie's voice choked, "when my family was killed." The words hung in the air like a dense fog. Dr. Miller couldn't stop himself from thinking about Mason. The events of that dreadfully cold day replayed in his mind, and he heard his mother screaming. Although he was still in the Hanson home, snow began to fall in the living room. The red-blue police lights danced in through the windows, and he could see Mason standing by the kitchen entrance. When they held Mason's funeral, they kept the casket closed, and Clyde never knew why. But now he did. A long piece of iron had pierced through the back of his skull and pushed its way out his right eye. It was a mile marker, the kind found on a 2-lane highway. But there it was, lodged through Mason's head. All sorts of gristle and fluid leaked from the visceral wound, but the hardest thing to look at was the eyeball dangling from the tip of the rod. Aside from the metal pike through his head, Mason wore the same outfit he did when he died: long blue jeans, a hooded sweatshirt, and a winter jacket. Except now they were bloodstained and torn. Some of his limbs were missing too, ripped off their joints by the force of 2 vehicles sliding on black ice, crashing into each other. "Doc." Finally, after what felt like centuries, Richie broke the silence. "Did you still want to know why I called you?" Clyde sat there and agreed to continue listening, like he had a choice anyway. 2 nights ago, Marissa and I both woke up to Ellie at the foot of our bed. She just stared at us with these hollowed eyes, and when I was about to speak, Marissa said, "Ellie, sweetie, is something wrong?" Our daughter stood there and made the widest smile I think I've ever seen on her. The kind of smile where if you kept it up any longer, there would be fear of it freezing on her face forever. I finally spoke up and said, "Elle, your mother is talking to you." "Fuck you, you limp dick bastard," she hollowly said. "Ellie," Marissa said in her disapproving mother voice. Ellie's smile dropped as she turned to Marissa. "Shut your dry cunt up, bitch." Marissa and I immediately looked at each other, mouths open wide. "We're all going to die now," Ellie said before running out of our room, giggling. We rushed out of bed after her, but our bedroom door slammed shut just as we approached it. While Ellie's giggling roared into a manic laughter outside our room, I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Despite knowing it couldn't have been Ellie holding it shut, I still said, "Ellie, sweetie, please let go of the door. No one is in trouble. We just want to talk, okay?" I expected to hear my daughter respond, maybe even hear her tell me to go fuck myself or something. But the response we heard wasn't Ellie. There was another voice. I don't think I'll ever forget it. How deep it sounded. The raspy tone that sounded like tires on gravel. The piercing frequency like the bass notes of an electro-theremin. It only shouted 2 words. 2 words, spoken like fingers on a chalkboard, was all it took to turn our blood cold. "Come home." Dr. Miller's face lost all its color as he asked under his breath, "What did you just say?" But Richie didn't hear him. He was too deep into his memory, reliving his nightmare. We didn't know what to think. We only looked at each other terrified. Like the night with Ellie's room, I pointed my shoulder toward the door and ran full force with everything I had. I kept trying and trying, but it felt like running into a brick wall. Eventually, my shoulder went limp, and pain burned my muscles. I had to ask Marissa for her to help, and with both our strengths, we finally broke through. Turning on the hallway lights, we saw it, standing behind my little girl, the demon of Nebraska. This grotesque-looking creature had the build of a 6-foot linebacker and was as dark as crude oil. Besides the 4 limbs and a head, it looked nothing close to human, and no animal on God's green earth could ever compare to that ugly fucking thing. Even though the demon was just standing, its body rippled and flowed, like ink in water. The skin, if you could even call it that, looked almost amphibious the way light reflected off it, giving it a slimy gloss. But the thing that still terrifies me, even when I close my eyes, was the fact that it had no facial features. None. There we were, standing, facing this dark thing, and it stared back with what felt like a million eyes. But there weren't any. No lips. No nose. Nothing. My wife screamed right in my ear, breaking me out of my trance. But before I had time to react, we watched the demon raise its hand. Ellie, like a marionette doll, followed suit. She raised her hand and held it out, mimicking the demon. Then at the same time, both of them made a shoe motion toward the stairway. They sent us flying out of the room, smashing through the guardrails, down the stairs, and landing hard in the dining room. Dr. Miller turned to see the broken guardrails again, then trembled in his seat. As I looked up the stairs, I saw the demon of Nebraska levitating off our carpet, slithering effortlessly in the air, heading toward me. The demon picked me up without even touching me, and I watched those razor-sharp fingers slowly extend from its hand, moving closer to my chest, slicing every inch of skin it touched. Then, without any warning, I was dropped to the floor, landing on my head, forcing my eyes to rattle and shake. If that didn't give me a concussion, I definitely got one when the demon violently pushed me out of the dining room into the living room, smashing my head through the wall. I looked up and saw the demon turn toward Marissa. She was still on the floor, grumbling in pain, maybe unconscious. I don't know. All I knew was my wife was going to die. The demon lifted one of its arms, its palm facing Marissa, making her body fly toward the creature, setting its grip perfectly around her neck. The sharp fingers sliced right through her neck, beheading my wife right in front of me. Blood spewed from her as her body fell limp to the ground. Her head shot upward, bouncing, then rolling on the table. Black hands picked it up and placed fingers right into her eyes before pulling them back out of the sockets. It looked right at me, with no mouth and all teeth. That fucking thing grinned at me. Did you hear what I just fucking said? It grinned at me. And that was it. That's all I remember from that night. I must have blacked out after watching all that. Some fucking joke, huh? Why couldn't I have blacked out sooner? Why didn't I die with my family? Why did it let me fucking live, Doc? Tears flowed as Richie's voice grew quiet. There wasn't a reaction from the doctor, except that the nickname Doc didn't bother him anymore. Miller sat there, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a thing to say. Not a single thought. Nothing. He didn't believe in heaven or hell, but if purgatory existed, this was it. Is that why Mason is here? And Ellie? Well, I can honestly say I'm glad I wasn't conscious to see what happened to her. The next thing I remember was waking up, and it was morning. Yesterday morning. My entire body ached, but I still forced myself up, wincing from the pain. I had to find them. I already knew in my heart they were gone, but I had to see it for myself. I found Marissa's headless body lying on our dining room floor. Her head was nowhere to be found, and I looked. But if I'm being honest, I'm not sure I wanted to find it. Between her breasts was a wide cavity. The bones from her ribcage stuck out through her skin. Her heart was gone, just ripped out. And you know what else? No blood. I saw it shooting out of her arteries like a fountain the night before, but that morning, no blood. I lifted her off the table, holding her one last time, and dragged her corpse to the basement, where I covered her up with one of the blankets, and then went to see what the demon did to my little girl. As I moved through the house, I saw the damage. Every item we had was either thrown, smashed, or in pieces. I avoided the mess and finally got to Ellie's room, where I found her sitting, propped up by her bed. Her body drooped. Her arms and legs had lost all color as they lay flopped by her side, and her golden hair was covering her face. I didn't want to move her. I didn't want to remember her like that, so I wrapped her up with her favorite blanket. You see, Doc, I'm a man who needs logic, a man who needs answers just like you, so I started researching. After I placed Ellie next to her mother, I left the house and went down to the university library. That's where I found that book, the one that made you weak. They had even more books, archives on top of archives, all dating back to the late 1700s. I basically spent the entire day digging through archives, researching online, but I found my answers. The Locust Plague of 1874, the Diaboli Locustarum, the Great Purge of Fire, it's all out there. But no one knows about the horrors that lived here, still do. You see, the Diaboli Locustarum never wanted to even the score. They didn't just want to win the battle, they wanted to win the war. And they did. They made sure that no matter what happened to them, this was their land, and it will always be their land. Why else would they just let themselves be burned alive? I don't think they were just sitting in their burning homes, playing cards, ready for Grandma to finish cooking. They would have retaliated. I mean, there has to be a reason they didn't fight. And you know why? Because they opened the portal, but it was never closed. And the only ones who could close it were burned alive over 100 years ago. There was a pause. Richie was waiting for his therapist to say something, but the doctor was no longer in. It was just Clyde Miller, numb, terrified, and really wishing he took Richie's offer for the flask when he had the chance. Doc. Returning, remembering where he was, Clyde answered, "Yes, Richie. I just wanted to thank you for listening to me. That's all." Richie pointed toward the small recorder by Dr. Miller. "I see you've been recording us." "Yeah, I record all my sessions for notes." "I know. So listen." His voice cleared. His mannerism changed. He wasn't the depressed-looking, trauma-filled man he was just a moment ago. Richie's eyes locked with his therapist's, and he said, I've been watching you this entire time. I know you believe me. Whether you admit it or not, I know you do. If there's even a fraction of you that believes me, you'll take that recording and you'll share it everywhere. Got it? Clyde objected. There's way too much sensitive information in here. That's a HIPAA violation. I could lose my license. I never signed any papers, remember? He smirked. As far as anyone knows, you were just here for a visit. Miller bit his tongue. He knew he was outsmarted. I can't leave this world knowing what I know, going through what I went through. People have to know. People have to know that some stories just aren't stories. That there's real evil in the world, maybe lurking around your home. We fight demons every day, but people need to know. Some demons can't be fought. He wanted to say something, but Clyde kept his mouth shut. By now, he knew it didn't matter what he said to Richie. He had already made his mind. This was the kind of determination that only came from a man who lost everything. In less than 3 months, this man lost his family, his house, and now himself. The whiplash alone would be too much for anyone, including Dr. Miller, and he only heard the story. That was enough to bring back the bad feeling, the stoic fear of what could happen next, the unrelenting agony as anxiety gnaws at your heels, the hyperfixation of the worst scenario replaying over and over. It bruises your consciousness and distracts you from everything else. That's what the bad feeling was for Clyde. And as his patient looked through him, he knew that Richie was haunted by it too. For the first time, Miller understood Richie. Okay, Richie, I will, he said, pocketing the recorder. Richie exhaled relief. Thank you for everything. And here, he handed him the large book and a thick legal envelope. Inside were handwritten notes, a list of resources to look into, and a large stack of money. It's about $5,000. I told you you'd get paid. Richie smiled and patted his therapist on the back. Richie, I don't know what to say. I think it's best if we both stop talking now. If you'll excuse me, I think it's time I reunited with my family. Would you kindly show yourself out? Understood, Clyde said. He collected his items, including the envelope, and started making his way to the door, giving one last look toward the kitchen to see Mason, who was no longer there. Clyde Miller walked out of the Hanson home, closed the door. Then, bang! It was clear as day. He stopped at the stairway and sat on the top step, processing what just happened. He looked back, imagining what just took place. He imagined time began to slow down as it all unfolded. The trigger, the chamber, the hammer, all three moving in sync, shifting from their restful positions. Sparks would light the room, but only for a brief moment. The hammer struck the primer, firing a piece of lead through Richie's brain, before dislodging and hitting the ceiling. Swiftly following the bullet would be a mix of maroon and crimson that'd splatter all along the wall, as if Jackson Pollock was starting a new painting right in the Hansons' living room. Richie's head jerked backwards from the inertia rippling throughout his entire body, forcing his neck to bend and smack through the wall. His body would slowly turn itself, putting him in the perfect position to collapse to the ground. But gravity wouldn't find Richie yet. Any speck of blood or membrane that didn't stain the wall would be perfectly suspended in the air, held together only by equilibrium. As time unthawed, gravity's magic would carefully pull those droplets back to Earth, ending their journey. Richie Hansen finally came home. When these thoughts ended, Miller got up from the steps and walked back to his car with a smile on his face. He noticed he wasn't afraid anymore. There was no sign of the bad feeling, no numbing anxiety, no dreadful thoughts, no scathing pain. He was free. Come home, Clyde. Come home. I'll admit, this was a terrific story. A huge thank you to C.S. Serna for sharing it. I'm honored to have been the first to read it on the show. And I'll also admit, I only read half of the story before recording. I just wanted to get an idea of the cadence of his writing, so I recorded part 2 as I read it. And about halfway through, when we're introduced to the demon that had taken over Ellie, I had to pause the recording because I was too freaked out to continue in that moment. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment or email me at redtreehousepod@gmail.com. As we turn down the lights on this episode, make plans to join me next time as I read part 1 of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.